In my last video, I introduced the concept of batch ability forecasting and then discussed how to design heuristics that would allow us to efficiently forecast what abilities that we will do in the future. In this video, I will be talking about how to optimize your training/practice in order to get those heuristics that you've designed down to the subconscious level so they can be handled without having to think. The methods that I will be discussing in this video are built around my batch ability forecasting playstyle. However, there is no inherent reason why these methods wouldn't work for some other playstyle or some other theoretical model. Before I begin, I think it's important for me to have a bit of a disclaimer. I am not a neuroscientist. I'm not a cognitive psychologist. I don't have access to an fMRI, and so I cannot directly analyze how other people's brains work. However, I can analyze mine, and I'm also not saying that my method is a perfect solution. It's definitely not. But currently, it's the least shitty solution that I've come up with. But I do have a lot of experience teaching in an environment where having a practical understanding of cognition in high intensity and high stress situations is valuable. And as a result of that, I think about this subject regularly. Feel free to have a guess in the comments as to what you think it is that I teach. Ultimately, these are all suggestions that are based off my personal experiences teaching, my experiences learning, and also practicing. Everyone learns a bit differently. I do not anticipate that all of the suggestions that I'm going to be providing are going to work perfectly for you. Your goal when trying to implement these, or implement what I'm talking about, it should be to try to figure out how to modify these ideas so that they work for you. Before we start talking about specific strategies to practice or train, I think it's very important to understand what it is that we're actually trying to accomplish here and how our brains work. So in order to do that, let's talk about what it means to have intuition. A YouTuber by the name of Jim Can't Swim, who makes interrogation analysis and criminal psychology videos, has a really good definition, at least I think, of what intuition is. His definition is that intuitions occur when your brain makes a significant match or mismatch between the present moment and past experiences, but this cognitive recognition doesn't fully reach your conscious awareness. I think that this is an excellent definition to work with, though I do have a mildly pedantic disagreement with some of his wording. Specifically, characterizing the past-present match or mismatch as needing to be significant. I believe that it only actually needs to be sufficiently similar for that intuition to occur, though the strength of that intuition increases as the significance of that match or mismatch increases. There are a few nuances and implications associated with this definition that I think are worth mentioning, especially considering the context of how I'm going to be using this definition. So let's go over those now. The first thing that I want to highlight is the fact that your subconscious gets the information that your brain receives first. Second, your subconscious controls what information your conscious mind gets. Third, it can come to conclusions about what to do. If you then act on these conclusions, you've made a subconscious decision. Fourth, your subconscious has access to your memories. Fifth, the conscious can send information to your subconscious, and it can also request information from your subconscious. A good classic example of this particular nuance is the good old-fashioned, you are now breathing manually, you are now aware of how your tongue is sitting in your mouth, you're now aware that you have eyebrows, you're now aware that you can see your nose and your peripheral vision, stuff like that. Number 6, decisions made by your conscious get resolved or translated by your subconscious. So for example, it takes, hey, I want to pick up that cup and take a drink out of it, into which muscles need to be contracted for how long and when and how intensely, etc. Now, I would highly recommend that you just take a moment and consider and realize how quickly and efficiently and seamlessly your brain's able to do this sort of a translation. It's actually incredible. Seventh, this match or mismatch between the past experience and the present moment is done using pattern recognition. So the goal here is to identify the scenarios where we can know what decision or conclusion that our conscious would make. By the way, this is the purpose of the heuristics that we've come up with. And then we're going to try to get our subconscious to identify the scenarios that would then lead to those decisions so that it can know what should happen in those scenarios itself. This way, we can just let our subconscious make the calls because it already knows what the conscious is going to decide. Your conscious and your subconscious don't really need to work as if they're 100% in line. They can almost sort of work as if they were operating in parallel. It doesn't really work this way, but bear with me. What I'm saying here is that you can offload certain tasks to your subconscious and just let them handle it. And then your subconscious will forward other pieces of information to your conscious that it can't handle easily. In order to make this work and make this actually efficient, you got to understand sort of how your brain likes to work. And part of that is understanding that your conscious mind is going to want to take control. However, if you let your conscious sort of play backseat driver to the decisions being made by your subconscious, it's going to slow down your subconscious. You want to be able to trust your subconscious. So in the moment, you got to get yourself to be able to trust your intuition, no matter what. If your intuition gets it wrong, then retrain your intuition, but don't question its decision making in the moment. It is better to let your intuition make the mistake, recognize the mistake, stop, figure out what the solution is, then start over and try again to implement that solution, than it is to actually question yourself and question the decision before it's been made. Second, we also need to understand how our subconscious makes decisions, and we need to understand what does and doesn't work well for our subconscious in this decision-making process. Because the way that your conscious makes decisions and the way that your subconscious makes decisions are not the same. Your subconscious is associative, not analytical. It associates things as being like or unlike, but it doesn't analyze the meaning behind that. Your subconscious doesn't really think. It recognizes, it feels, it believes, it trusts, it knows. Anytime a given context doesn't have an answer that your subconscious knows or trusts, that decision gets kicked up to your active cognition. It gets kicked up to your conscious. As mentioned in the definition of intuition, these comparisons, these associations are being done comparing the past experience with the present situation. So it is comparing memories. Now, these memories are recorded sensoriously. That is, they are in terms of a given sensation. Each sensation is recorded as a separate memory and then linked to the other sensation memories associated with that event. When your subconscious is trying to make decisions and is comparing it to your memories, what's happening is that it's using the context, the action, and whether or not there was a reward to make a decision on what to do now. So it tries to find contexts that are really similar to the present situation. It then figures out what actions were done in that context and whether or not it worked out. Did it feel right? Combining this back with the fact that the way that your subconscious deals with memory comparisons is that it's going off of the sensation that occurred rather than any sort of meaning or anything like that. You are going to remember what the context looked like. You're going to remember what it sounded like, what it felt like, and so on and so forth. You're going to do the same for what it is that you actually did in that context. What did it look like? What did it feel like? What did it sound like? Then you're going to also remember if it felt like the right thing to do then, or if it felt like the wrong thing to do then. Did it sound right? Did it feel right? Did it look right? These memories are devoid of meaning because that's something that's handled by your conscious mind. When practicing or training, the goal should be to try to create as many memories that link context and action and reward or outcome or whatever word you want to use there. We want to create as many memories as we can where in this situation, we did this thing and it felt right. And the thing that we did should be the correct action. This means that repetition is going to be your friend, but it's only going to be your friend if you have a goal in mind when doing those repetitions. This means that if you're just high-fiving your keyboard and hoping that if you do that enough times, you'll kind of figure it out, then you're really just wasting your time and your effort. Variety is also going to be your friend here, as it allows your subconscious to figure out what is and isn't necessary to make a given association. This variety is only useful if it's creating memories that are usable by your subconscious. Now that I've put you all to sleep with all this boring shit, let's actually get to work and start talking about specific ways of practicing these sorts of things. It should be noted that during the process of recording this video, the Shadowlands pre-patch came out. And as a result, some of the footage that you're going to see is me practicing the new Fury playstyle as a result of the changes that were made. So it's not just simply me demonstrating, it's actually what it looks like when I want to practice. From my experiences teaching others, I believe that improvement occurs fastest when you're able to make small and incremental and discrete changes to your practice regime as you improve. Therefore, I think the best way to learn how to play a spec is to start at the most fundamental ability patterns, get comfortable with that, and then slowly start increasing the complexity. because I'm assuming that you're going to be practicing to use this in a raid or a dungeon, you want to try to mimic those sorts of conditions. So when you're practicing, it's best to turn off war mode because those abilities can change the way that you make your decisions and the way that the spec plays. The goal here is to try to reduce the number of variables that would potentially change the way that we make our decisions. And that way we can have a consistent foundation of something to practice with. And then we can always add other variables in later once we're comfortable with that foundation. When starting out, it's best to have the most consistent foundation possible. So one way that you can accomplish this is to start from out of combat, build up, do one rampage, and then get out of combat, and then reset it, let your rage fall down, let your buffs fall off, and then do it again. And so when practicing, this allows you to have that initial foundation of what should I do here? And I can repeat that over and over and over again, as you can see in this video. Once you have that initial bit of intuition built, then the next step is to extend it out. Don't run out of combat after that first rampage, just keep going and only use those main rotational abilities, namely Bloodthirst, Raging Blow, and Whirlwind, to try to get rampages, right? And really, again, focus on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. You're trying to accomplish getting an intuitive sense of how these patterns go. What are the patterns in ability usages? As you get more comfortable with the various patterns associated with how to get to your next rampage, then because you're almost certainly going to be tunnel visioning your action bars at this point, at least I'm assuming you would be, because that's a very natural thing to do, start limiting that. Start trying to limit how often you're looking at that. Force yourself to look at other things, and then only look at your action bars for a brief period of time. Try to do it so that you can do your abilities and know what to do next, simply by using your peripheral vision. Simply put, once you get used to doing these abilities, then get used to doing them without looking at your action bars. Once you have that initial foundation of the ability patterns that will be used, and then you've practiced it to the point where you don't have to be tunnel visioning your action bars constantly, then you can start adding in your short duration cooldowns such as Siegebreaker and Dragon's Roar. I think it's important to reiterate what it is that we're trying to accomplish when we're doing this practice. We are trying to write memories into our brain that can be easily associated by our subconscious, by our intuition. And our intuition uses senses, sensory memories, right? It remembers what it felt like, it remembers what it looked like, what it sounded like, etc. Focus on that when you are doing this practice. Focus on what it feels like. Take your conscious processing and take it away from what's happening in the game, and focus on what does it feel like when I hit those buttons? What does it sound like when I hit those buttons? What does it look like on the screen when I hit those buttons? One option that you have to try and attempt to insert these memories more easily into your subconscious is to exceed your conscious endurance. So if you think of your consciousness as sort of like a muscle, in that after a while of really focusing on something or being consciously aware of something, you kind of get tired. It's in the same way that muscles do. And when it's tired, you don't really want to use those muscles. So what happens is that it allows your subconscious to sort of take over for it. So the basic idea here is to practice until you want to give up because you're bored or tired or whatever, and then keep going. One option that you have to do this is to set a timer for yourself and force yourself to DPS or whatever you want to do for that arbitrary amount of time. So like 8 to 10 minutes, maybe even 15 minutes. Think of the longest possible fight that you could do and just force yourself to practice for that amount of time without stopping. Alternatively, you could practice after a full night of raiding or when you're really tired or sleepy. There's lots of different options that you have to try to do this. A personal mantra that I have is that if you can do something well when you're tired, then you can do it perfectly when you're not. This basically means you should try to get good at something when you're tired or when you're not at your best. Once you're comfortable using your abilities and you're comfortable doing it without having to tunnel vision your action bars the entire time, then it's time to start injecting a little bit more realism into your practice. It's time to start adding motion and movement. So start moving around while you're doing your DPS, while you're doing your rotation, whatever you want to call it, and focus on what it feels like. How does your hand change? How does your hand position change when you're moving to the left or to the right or etc.? Focus on what it feels like to do that DPS. Focus on what it looks like when you do that. Now, there are things that you can do to practice that don't actually require you to be playing the game. So the first one is visualization. Implementing this is fairly straightforward. I mean, just close your eyes and start visualizing what it looks like when you do particular patterns correctly. Visualize the movements or mechanics of a given encounter and what you would do in those scenarios, what it's going to look like and feel like to do those sorts of actions. Play what if scenarios in your head and visualize what you would do. Another option that you have is to record yourself and then analyze that footage, right? Record yourself doing one specific thing that you want to work on for a while, then go back and watch the tape. Analyze how well you were doing at that thing that you were working on, then practice more. And I mean, seriously, you should go practice more after you've watched the recording, because unless you implement the knowledge that you've gained, watching that tape, watching the recording is basically useless. So the two best things that I think that you can do if you're going to be recording yourself is watch and analyze it multiple times, and or practice immediately after you've watched the tape. If the recording that you're going to be analyzing is one of an entire encounter, or it's a really long recording, you should only really be focusing on analyzing the one thing that you're trying to improve at, because you're almost certainly going to have made a lot of other mistakes in that recording. Just ignore them for now. Focus on what it is that you're specifically trying to improve at that moment in time. One thing that you also could do is use a random number generator to give you a number between 1 and 100, and use that as a starting point to say, okay, if I'm at that amount of rage, what abilities would I want to do to get to my next rampage? This is essentially just creating flashcards, but for your rage. And when using these flashcards, essentially, you could basically create different starting scenarios, so that way you might say that, okay, well, I'm going to assume that this ability is on cooldown and this one is available. And so you can use that to help tailor the way that you think about this. And so from seeing just the rage number, you could have a plan for what you want to do. When creating practice regimes, try to identify situations where the decisions that you have to make in that situation are going to be different than what the default would be. And then try to figure out how can you recreate that sort of a situation or practice that sort of a situation when you're training. Over time, you're going to be able to basically develop an entire library in your head of all the various little contexts and all the various little situations where, oh, I should decide in this way versus that way, because it's just like this, which is similar to this other stuff, but it's actually more like this. So now I'd like to talk about a couple ideas that are probably not going to be particularly useful, but they have the potential to. And I think that they're very interesting, and they are at least tangentially related to what you might want to be accomplishing when you are practicing. So let's do that. So let's talk about flow states and autohypnotic trances. Another word that you might have heard is sort of being in the zone, right? This is a mindset that you get into when you're just purely focused on whatever is right in front of you. You're not really caring about how long it takes. You're not bothered by other things. You're in the zone, right? You're in a flow state or an autohypnotic trance, whatever name you want to use for it. Now, the trick is, how do you get into these states? And I think a fairly underrated method for entering a flow state is via the repetition of music. Your brain measures time by counting a set number of status updates or refreshes, and it uses that to measure time. And the example that I use to show that this is true is that, for example, when you have an adrenaline spike, the rate of refreshes actually increases in your brain, and so you have more refreshes, which means it feels like it's longer amount of time, even though it's the same actual time. So that's why you can have like a few minutes that feels like hours. Now, when these refreshes or status updates occur, your brain does a bit of a comparison. If the newest status is sufficiently similar to the previous status updates, then it is likely to delete at least one of those updates, and that could be either the new one or the older one. So when you're playing a single song on repeat, for example, it allows you to capitalize on this property, because eventually your brain is going to lose track of how many times you've played that song. And so what happens is that each status updates pretty much sounds like the last one. It's like, wait, I was listening to this song before, and it sounds like the similar period of time. So I guess no time has passed. You can't really tell how long it's been.
And so what happens is that it allows you to enter these flow states where you can just grind something out for a long period of time because you simply don't know how long it's been. So it especially if it's a shorter song, it feels as if it hasn't been that long because, well, the song's not that long and I've been at this part, so haha.
Well, at best, this example is verificationist, and at worst, it's purely me projecting. I think a good example of somebody doing this sort of thing to get into a flow state is David Goggins.
So when I bought the pull-up record, I listened to the song for 17 hours. It's 2 minutes and 13 seconds.
Beyond the simple fact that the song that he was listening to on repeat was meaningful to him, I think that by repeating it so many times, it allowed him to, one, get into his flow state, and two, maintain it.
Now, I have absolutely no citation for this. This is totally just judging on my personal experience and how it works for me. But I think that playing repetitive music can also allow you to more rapidly find the sort of rhythmic patterns in a given play style for a spec. From personal experience, the effectiveness is highly dependent on the specific songs or the genre of music that you use for the given spec, and each spec kind of has its different rhythm to how it plays, and therefore different types of music will suit some specs better than others. I realize how weird and like insane that sounds, but for me, having music playing really does help me sort of get a feel for the way a spec plays.
Now let's take a look at the roadmap that I laid out in the last video that I made. So I've previously covered how to build intuitive forecasting heuristics. In this video, I was talking all about how to train and how to get those heuristics that we've created and get them down to a subconscious level or an intuitive level. Now the next video is going to be, now that we have this sort of subconscious way of operating and how to predict what we want to do, how do we efficiently insert new information into our forecasted plan? For those of you who are still awake, I want to say thank you for watching my video, and I hope that it was at least interesting, and hopefully it was at least somewhat useful to you. I do have a request to make of you, just like the last time, which is I would like it if you could tell me why I'm wrong. Why is this practice method, why is this way of thinking about how to train and how to approach getting better at stuff, how is that wrong? What are the problems with this method? If you have questions, by all means, again, leave a comment and I'll do the best that I can to answer that question for you.